Hello and welcome to another edition of Blueprint Cymru podcast, asking the questions of where does Wales go to build its own future? And today we're going to be discussing the manifesto that New Wales has just published. The manifesto is moving away from retail policies of political parties and asking, what kind of country does Cymru want to become? We're going to talk about our sexy 6 E's, which are environment, energy, economy, education, evolution, existence. Joined on the podcast today by the audacious Gwynfil, fellow conspirator at New Wales.
The manifesto is really very different, isn't it? And quite deliberately so. I read it again this morning, and I've sent it to a few people I know quite well as well, and I'm waiting on some feedback from them to see what they have to say. But it really is quite thought-provoking, isn't it? That's the whole point. It really does give you a starting point of thinking, well, hang on a second, this is nothing like the Wales that I live in now, and this is nothing like all those manifestos that everyone else is writing about and talking about, some of which, fair enough, deal with sort of nitty-gritty minor policy issues, but none of which I personally feel, and I have read them all, apart from the Welsh Liberal Democrat one, which isn't out yet, and I didn't manage to finish Reform UK's because it was incredibly turgid. But, you know, I have read them all, and I don't feel that any of them contains a vision for Wales.
And this is what I think we're trying to do with the New Wales manifesto, is say to people that let's move away from policies that are managing our nation's decline and actually be aspirational and think about how we want to design our own future. And this is really, you know, we go into the environment, energy, economy, education, evolution, and existence. And the point of those sexy 6 E's is, apart from the alliteration, which is very nice, is you know, there are 6 areas that we can, as a nation, all agree on caring about, and all agree that we can do something about with the current powers that are with the Senedd, but also on an individual level. You know, there are areas that touch us all, and we can have a thoughtful input into them.
Absolutely, and they're all absolutely key when it comes to feeding into building a vision for a future Wales, isn't it? That's the key. We have to have a goal. What do we want Wales to look like? What is Cymru of the future going to be? And until you have that goal, we can't really work towards it. We're just, like you say, playing around the edges or managing the decline. And the other thing, I was thinking about this when I was reading over it again, is in the last few days, it is inevitable that there's going to be some quite dramatic constitutional change across the UK. I mean, this is coming. And not just because of the possibility of Sinn Féin in power in Northern Ireland, Plaid Cymru in power in Wales, and the SNP, and potentially an independent supporting majority in Scotland, potentially an independent supporting majority in Wales too. It's not just because of that. It's because of all the wider movements of political change that are happening across the entirety of the UK. You know, we essentially have a 5-party system in England now. We have 6-party systems in Scotland and Wales. So, you know, that is a very, very different environment and a very, very different place to the 20th century, which became a very unionist century, partly because we had 2 world wars which drove us all together. You know, that's another thing that people completely forget about, is, you know, in 1905, 1906, there was a real movement and a real consideration of both Scotland and Wales having dominion status in the same way as Canada had quite recently had. You know, these things were seen as a natural evolution. And what I'm concerned about, one of the things I'm most concerned about, is that the potential for, and I know we've discussed this in the past, a much more abrupt constitutional breakdown than would be ideal from a Cymru perspective. And I'm genuinely concerned about that. And lots of things could feed into that, you know, an angry, irate, bloody nose being given to Nigel Farage by the electorate in Cymru and the electorate in Scotland, essentially meaning that he starts to throw his toys out of the pram, doubles down on English nationalism, creates a narrative across the border which becomes quite anti-Cymru and anti-Scotland. You know, why are we subsidizing those buggers over there? Why are we looking after them? Why are we giving money to them? And that manifests itself across maybe 20–25% of the population in England, but that's still a significant amount. And that division then becomes a new Remainer, Leaver division in parts of England. And that then feeds into a wider UK narrative, which doesn't then create an evolutionary separation of the constitution into constituent parts that can work very well together and that can all be stronger, both together and apart. And instead, what we have is a fragmentary breakdown, which is damaging for everybody, in the way that Brexit was incredibly damaging when it happened. And let's face it, Cymru's not ready for that.
And really what we're trying to say here with this manifesto is that it's beholden on us in Cymru to think about where we want to go and start making that case for ourselves, and really move away from that being directed from London. And as we talk about, and within the manifesto, part of that, which is under the evolution section, is to say that where we've got to so far is part of that journey. It's not the end. We know that the Senedd is not a perfect entity, far from it. But what do we want it to become? Where is it going to go? And how do we see that comes to fruition? And unless we're going to engage with it and really think about that and demand of the parties that are in the Senedd, but also the parties that are in Westminster, of what we want out of Cymru, then really we are doing what is the tradition of the United Kingdom and just going with the tide of globalization and history.
In some ways, you're sounding very Rhun ap Iorwerth there, certainly around the constitutional aspect. It's on a journey, and that he wants to take people on a journey towards independence, which certainly I think is part of it. And I think a lot of Wales, particularly anybody under the age of about 45, 50, you know, they are on a journey. And
perhaps, you know, perhaps I'm also influenced by the Quebecois society as well, having, you know, been here for 3 years, and we are just starting to heat up for the provincial assembly elections that are here in October. So yeah, there's quite a lot of that conversation happening here as well, even though Quebec arguably is a bit further down the road as far as knowing what it is.
That's what I was about to say. I mean, I would say that Quebec is further along in the journey than Cymru is in many ways. But then in other ways, it's quite different, because Cymru's obviously been here an awful lot longer than Quebec has. So there's a much deeper root to the Cymru tree in many ways. And that's something that can be used to both accelerate and fashion and inform wherever the Cymru decides to go and how it wants to get there. But I'm going to take us back a little bit. Before I take us on a complete tangent, but first I'm going to take us back a little bit and think about, there's a phrase that I hate, thinking outside the box. You know the phrase thinking outside the box? And I hate it, because if someone tells you that they're thinking outside the box, or that you need to think outside the box, you should have asked yourself a long time ago, why the hell am I inside a box in the first place? And one of the problems for us in Cymru is that we are definitely inside a box. And a lot of us don't realize we're inside the box. And even more of us cannot recognize the size and shape of that box. And until we understand the size and shape of the box we're in, we're going to find it quite hard to think in ways that break that envelope, just to mix my metaphors, because I do like to mix metaphors, to break outside of that box and to think outside it. Now, as you know, Simon, I am very much someone who does not live in a box at all and thinks all around the place. You know, I'm effectively thinking across the wide void of space, and I refuse to accept any walls or boxes at all. But in a specific Cymru sense, we really need to understand the parameters of that discussion and where the edges of the box lie, what we can do whilst we're inside that box, and what we want to do once we divest ourselves of that box. And make no mistake, we have to get rid of that box because the box clearly isn't working. It's effectively a straitjacket at the moment. I'm mixing my metaphors again.
I could say it's quite a heavy mix of metaphors there.
It is. I do love it. I actually quite enjoy mixing metaphors, and I have been known to do it deliberately just to wind people up. I hope none of the listeners are being wound up by this. And genuinely, I hope that they're actually seeing
even if they are, even if they are, this is a good thing. We want to upset a few people to get them to engage with us and to think about where we're going.
Yes, and that's the point, isn't it? That's the core of my mixed metaphor point, is that we do need to be thinking in not necessarily revolutionary ways, but in ways that have not occurred to us to think in the past. Because the world is changing at an immensely fast pace. You know, all those things that were relevant and quite steady and quite fixed and sat in those traditions within the 20th century are being torn apart by forces beyond our control. You know, whether that's Trump and his geopolitics, whether it's AI, whether it's the impacts of technology really sitting in, whether it's our mobile phones, you know, all of these things are completely transformational in ways that no one would ever have anticipated when all of these structures were being built and set up across the 20th century. And that goes as far as the extent of, you know, political ideologies. I don't see any value in socialism, nationalism, not even really in liberalism in the 20th century sense, because those concepts really don't have any meaning in an applicable, relevant way. And we have to invent new ones. You know, we've got to create new ways of thinking about every aspect of our lives and the world around us that are fit for the future we're already living in.
And I think the generations that are coming through now and coming into their own and into political power, as far as their agency to vote and change things, I believe that they don't have any connection to any of those terminologies that you've just mentioned. You know, they know and feel and think certain things are a bit crap, and you know, the fact that they can't get a house, or you know, there's no decent job, that, you know, all of those things which certain political parties of both left and right can hook into, but there's nobody saying this is our narrative, this is where we want to go with this, and why do you feel this? And one of the things that we really dig into in the manifesto, which I know is both a passion for yourself and me, is the education aspect of how we structure a future in Wales, and you take in the best bits of the rest of the world, and I think we term it as a cognitive infrastructure, don't we, in the manifesto?
Absolutely.
And that really is like the base of where we build society from.
And it's a really good example as well, because, you know, the premise for that education bit, which is quite short really in the manifesto, but the premise is, if I was building, or if we were building an education system today that's fit for purpose today for the world that our children are growing up in today, how would we do it? And the outline that we posit in the manifesto is the kind of education system that you would design if you were starting from scratch. You know, if we were creating an utopian society right now today, and we were looking at the education for it, we would not, I can guarantee you that there is no way in hell we would take the ghost of a Victorian education system and try and impose it on the basis that, you know, within that world of technology, this Victorian structure that came out of, you know, an agrarian revolution and then an industrial revolution is going to be the right solution for the education of future generations in our modern technological world, because it isn't. It's just not going to work. But we are finding it very hard to move away from that structure, not just in Cymru, but across the UK, across the Western world. It is proving to be an incredibly difficult tanker to redirect when it comes to education. It's not to say that some places aren't doing it well, because a lot of those ideas that I suggested or we suggested in that manifesto are working in other places globally, and there is incredibly good evidence for their effectiveness and efficacy already. So it's not just a pipe dream that we've plucked out of the sky and thrown out there and hope that it's going to work. There's good, strong evidence that it really does work well, and it would work very well for us in Cymru. I'm going to take you back to my tangent, though, because you sort of introed it quite well when you were talking about younger people. So I've been watching with a lot of interest the data as it develops, and some of the mechanics of what's been happening since we got into the election period in the Senedd for the Senedd elections, which is now when we're recording this, we're about 27 days away. People might be listening to this and it might be imminent. It might be tomorrow, who knows? It might have already been. And if it's already been, I'm about to make a prediction. So I may look very stupid for anybody listening after the election, or I may look like a genius, who knows? So I was looking at that and I was looking at the trends, and it's been made incredibly confusing. I'm going to give you some of the psephological and data background, although this might be a bit boring and a little bit difficult to follow. One of the challenges has been that even the leading pollsters have used different methodologies for repeated polls. So YouGov are probably the most comprehensive pollster when it comes to doing Welsh polls. And their last 3 polls for Wales have all had different methodologies. So it's incredibly hard to build and track trends. And then on top of that, we've got a lot of incredibly poor quality polling. Some sample sizes as low as 500, some with 800, some methodologies that, which I think are quite flawed in many ways. Now, so More in Common is a good one. More in Common use a methodology that I consider quite badly flawed from a Welsh perspective, from a Cymru perspective, because they've used a methodology that they've built by looking at general election data, particularly across England or across the UK as a whole. Now, that's not to say that More in Common aren't a reputable pollster. They are. I just don't think that the methodology and the techniques they're using for Cymru are particularly accurate. So with all of those caveats and feeding all of this data into my model, I then decided to play around with my model. And the way I played around with my model was I slightly reduced the number of people who say they're going to vote Reform who actually are going to vote Reform. Basically, because Reform are having a bit of a nightmare. It's a bit of a shit show for them. They're losing a lot of members in Wales because they've mishandled their candidacy structure. They've mishandled a lot of things. They seem to have sort of lost their focus on Wales. They seem to be looking at Scotland instead. They're a little bit messy and a little bit shapeless. They're distracted by the local elections in England because they desperately want to win 2,000 seats across the locals in England, and they might. So all of that has meant that, they've drifted a little bit. And I think that a lot of their potential voters will stay home. So I just took that down a little bit, and then I upped what I call the younger voters, which is actually 45 and below, right? So it's not that young, but it's younger than I am and younger. So 45 and below.
It just made me feel very depressed as I near my 46th birthday.
Yeah, sorry, you just cut off there. You're not one of the younger voters. So and I again, so all I did was put a fairly modest uptick in turnout relative to normal sort of turnouts of under 45s, and a relatively high turnout overall for a Senedd election. So I've been running my models with a relatively high turnout anyway, closer to 50% than the last one I think was 44. So I do think there will be a decent turnout. And I think that additional turnout, a lot of it will be made up of younger voters who wouldn't normally have voted. So that's how I've done it. Anyway, I'm going to tell you what I got with that. And as you know, a lot of the 5th and 6th seats are very marginal. So these are the bands, right? So doing that, Plaid came out with anything between 43 and 49 seats. So that's a strong minority government or an actual majority government, which would be, you know, quite a thing, really, all things considered. The Greens come out of that with 12 to 17 seats, because they actually pick up 2 in a few places. Well, they pick up 2 in this constituency that I'm in, for example. Reform come out with about 18 to 24, which is a lot lower than they've been predicted, but they do come out with about 18 to 24 because they're guaranteed 1 in each, and then they get a couple of doubles. Labour do okay, actually. They still come out with 10 to 14. But the Cons and the Libs are wiped out because they share about the residual 2 or 3. They share between them. The Libs probably get none. Cons might get, well, they might get 1 and 2 or whatever it is. But you think about that, you know, if it's the top end of all of those bands, that is a 2/3 Plaid Green Senedd, which would give you 2/3 of the Senedd as nominally independent supporting MSs. And I can't stress this enough. These were relatively minor tweaks. This is not wishful thinking, pie in the sky, you know, changing the fundamental data from the polling that's coming in. It's minor tweaks based on demographics and who's actually voting. Who stays home, who comes out to vote. A lot of young people traditionally just haven't voted. But if they're energized, and if they're aware, you'd be amazed how many people just aren't aware of elections when they happen at a Senedd level or at a local government level. People just don't know. And obviously,
so what's changing now then, that they are aware? Do we know that they're more aware now?
Part of that is the level of coverage, isn't it? So the level of coverage for these Senedd elections on mainstream media has been closer to the kind of awareness levels that you get for a general election. And that's going to have a big impact. There was some very interesting data recently about where people get their news in Wales. And Wales is still, you know, when it comes to Welsh-specific media, we're still living in a barren landscape. And we are still very unfavorably by comparison to Scotland. The same survey was done in Scotland. And we are getting a little bit heavy into a lot of polling and data here, so my apologies to the listeners. That was quite a recent poll as well. You know, around 9%, so certainly less than 10% of Welsh people exclusively use Welsh media sources to discover what's going on. You know, that's 1 in 10. That's very poor, and it's a poor reflection on the media in Wales. It's a poor reflection on us in Wales that we're not actively and proactively going out of our way to address that, not to do a disservice to those who are. You know, people like Will Hayward have a very rapidly growing news media machine. Nation have done amazing work given the size of the budget they have. But these are islands of hope in a sea of emptiness. I didn't mix my metaphors there. But really, you know, the bigger engines, the ones that could really make a difference, Wales Online or what was the old Media Wales owned by Reach PLC, you know, they have no plan or vision to really change that media landscape in Wales. But they could, you know, instead they just the corporate choice there is to milk that cash cow for as long.
I was going to say, is when I've interviewed Will Hayward for this podcast, you know, he's made it very clear, you know, they aren't going to change that because it is all about getting clicks, and that's how you get your sponsors, and then, you know, that's how you pay for your media.
Yeah, well, it's a cash cow for Reach PLC, and I don't think they're going to, because it's a fringe or periphery cash cow. I don't think they're going to see or understand the potential, even when they see a former reporter of theirs like Will breaking away and carving out a very fast, very lucrative niche for himself with a very specific Welsh offering. building it from nothing very quickly, you know, and the fact that Will has managed to do that is testament to that gap in the market. And you know, I think there is a huge gap in the market. You probably don't remember Thomas G from the 19th century. Thomas G is the person who set up Banner ac Amserau Cymru at the end of the 19th century when the printing presses came out. And Thomas G made himself an incredible amount of money selling penny sheets, news penny sheets, the old Banner ac Amserau Cymru, because that gap in the market was there. He saw it and he exploited it. And that gap in the market is there again. And the survey data shows that that gap in the market is there again, by the way. A lot of people in Wales really do hunger for sources of relevant Welsh news, not just local news, but relevant Welsh news for the whole of Wales, which has an impact on them and which is important to them. And no one is genuinely feeding that need. We don't have a national newspaper. We don't really have multi-channel national platforms. We have.
Wouldn't the argument be that like newspapers and the like are dead?
So newspapers in their traditional format, Banner ac Amserau Cymru, wouldn't work as just a printed sheet. But if Thomas Gee was alive today, I absolutely bet you that his printed sheet would have a podcast and an app and breaking news, and he would be reaching people across other platforms. Thomas Gee would have people on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook, and would be taking all of these channels to still provide the same service, because it's still the same service. What you're doing is providing information for those who are hungering for information, and you're providing accurate information, and you are a trusted source. And there is a hunger for trusted sources providing accurate information about the things that people care about. And it isn't happening in Wales. Massive gap in the market, honestly. I mean, if I had the money and the resources, I would be trying very hard to find ways to feed that gap, whether that was by working in collaboration with people like Will and Nation and others, or whether it was by starting something new, or although there is a need for some scale. But yes, absolutely.
And I guess this is where it really feeds into the New Wales manifesto for the last of the two E's, the evolution and the existence, because it is about like how and what do we want the media landscape to evolve into for Wales, and also that existence, like who in what is Cymru, and what does it want to project into the world as far as its image. And I mean, we really we looked into that and tried to put some thought-provoking ideas into those final two E's. So, but I guess the one part that maybe
I'm glad you brought us back on message there. You'd let me rant on for quite long enough, so I'm glad you dragged us back to the manifesto.
Well, you know, in its way, it's relevant, and one part that I think in the manifesto that will connect obviously everybody, and particularly with the world that the US president is currently forging for us all, is the economy side. And you know, we talk about the LG mega manufacturing center in there, and how that really didn't do what it was purported to do before it was introduced. And actually here in Quebec, they've had a similar thing over a mega, I think it was a Panasonic battery plant that was supposedly going to happen and ended up just wasting a lot of Quebec government money, and hasn't happened. So you know, that economy that we look into, I guess, really self-respect. It's about respecting ourselves as parts of the economy and how we want that economy to look.
There's a danger. There's both a danger and an opportunity there for Wales, isn't there? I mean, I think I don't want to get involved in incredibly complex economic discussions, because I've already probably bored people enough with data and polling. But one of the things that I would love to do as New Wales, if New Wales had money and resources, one of the research projects I would love to commission is a relatively straightforward one. So engage an academic department somewhere to do a really deep piece of research, financial research, where their goal was to discover the level of corporate rents, so not domestic, no residential, just commercial rents across Wales. So how much commercial rent is paid in Wales? So, you know, your local Boots store are paying, office block around the corner, whoever it is, and where those rents are going. So, and what is the value of all of that commercial rent in Wales, and how much of it is leaving the Welsh economy and never coming back? And I would warrant that the sums leaving the Welsh economy are in the high billions, right? Quite significant billions. And the sums staying in the Welsh economy are negligible. And you think about the long-term impact of that very simple extractive rentier process on an economy like Wales, because that's happening every single year. It's happening every single month. Every month, a huge amount of money that is generated inside Wales is leaving Wales in an insidious and permanent sort of slow drip of extraction. It's like having your life's blood sucked out of you on a constant basis. And it's a really easy one to understand as well, because everybody understands commercial rent. You know, I'm renting a warehouse, or I'm renting an office, or I'm renting a shop, and I'm paying X amount of rent for it, and that's how it works. And that money is leaving Wales. So if you can put a figure on that, even if it's an estimated figure based on really good data and research, obviously you have to do it in confidence. You have to, you know, it's going to take a while, you know, 2 or 3 years, because unfortunately we don't live in a transparent world. I actually personally am a firm believer that all rental agreements should be clear and transparent. We should know exactly how much anybody is paying for any given building that they're renting, and to whom they're paying, and what the terms of their lease and arrangement are, so that you iron out the lumps and bumps, and you don't get landlords shafting the naive, and you don't get relationships between companies where ownership is related and there are favorable terms, and there's a kind of legal but different type of corruption in that case. So all of it should be transparent, and it should all be up online, and we should all be able to work it out. We should all be able to see it, and we should all know where the money's going. But that's slightly different. You know, that's thinking outside the box. But you imagine if I had that number. You imagine I had that number, and I was telling the people of Wales, so did you know that every year in Wales, X billions is just taken away and goes? And that's X billions, not of government money, but of money that's been generated by our economy, that we're not feeling the benefit. We're not feeling the benefit from that. And that's just commercial rents.
And if the listeners got an opinion on that, they should visit our website, which is new.wales, and they can write to us, and they can tell us, and they can find us on the socials, and they can find us on LinkedIn and make comments on the manifesto and on your views.
Yes, absolutely. Bring it on.
So,
and I'm happy to debate with anybody as well. I'm happy to sit down and discuss and talk these things through, because we don't debate and discuss and talk things through enough. So the other thing I was thinking about, to take us all the way back to what we started at, because we are coming towards the end of our allotted time, a vision for Wales. Now, I'm not usually a huge soundbite person, but I'm going to give you a soundbite of my vision for Wales. And essentially, the way I see a future Wales is much more Finland than England, because the Finland model works for a small nation like Cymru, and will work for a small nation like Cymru. Obviously not a carbon copy. You know, you've got to grow and develop your own way. But the premise and the values that underpin it, and the goals and the aims of the way Finland has structured itself align far more with what is possible and desirable for Cymru than the very, very different model that England has built for itself around the southeast and London. And at the moment, we're a pale, shadowy version of the England version. You know, everything's built around Cardiff. So Cardiff is a relatively wealthy city in an incredibly poor Cymru. And London is an incredibly wealthy city in a relatively poor England. But that's not what we want. And I don't think it's what we should aspire to have. And that means a very big change in mindset and thinking, even within what we can do today with the very limited resources and the squeeze that's upon us. And that mindset change isn't just a government mindset in Wales, it is an individual mindset. We have to change the way we think about what we do in our lives and in our world and in our Cymru, because that feeds into it. So we've got to be a bit more Finnish as well. So we've got to be more Finnish and less British.
That sounds like a good sentiment to commend to the listener.
I knew you'd like my soundbite. It's got a great ring to it, hasn't it? More Finland than England.
It's always a joy to speak with you, Gwern. And yes, commend the listener to go to our website, new.wales, and read the manifesto. It is very short. All those the 6 sexy E's, or the sexy 6 E's, however you like to term it. they're
also listeners and anybody who does, if you do enjoy what we do on the podcast and want us to do more, you know, we have zero resources. I've got to be honest, we have very few resources. So please click on the donate button and sign up. Give £1 a month, £5 a month, £50 a month, £500 a month.
Yes. Leave us all your wealth. We'll do multiple surveys with it. So no, it'd be great to hopefully hear a lot of input from everybody in Wales on this. And for now, Gwern, diolch yn fawr for being a guest. And we will say goodbye to everybody.